All right, you are live.
All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our subcommittee meeting on public safety for the Cannabis Compliance Board. I'm going to call this meeting to order. I see that we have all of our committee members present with us here on Zoom, so thank you all for being timely this morning. So that means we do have a quorum and we'll be able to proceed on this morning's meeting. So again, welcome to committee members and welcome to the attendees who are joining us as well. I don't think we're going to have a terribly long meeting today, which is probably good news because I know all of you have other things to move on to today. But before we move on to our main agenda item, which is the approval of potential recommendations, we're first going to go to agenda item 1, which is public comment. And by way of reminder, if you are an attendee and you'd like to give public comment, there should be an icon where you can raise your hand. And if you are calling on the phone, I believe you press *9 to let us know that you would like to make public comment. So let's give it a second and see if we have anybody who'd like to give public comment. Again, you just want to make sure to raise your hand so I can see that you'd like to give public comment. I don't think I see anyone on the Zoom with us with a hand raised, nor do I see anyone on the phone. Amber, could I ask for your assistance as well? Do you see anyone for public comment that I might be missing?
I see no public comment.
Great, thank you so much. So we will close agenda item 1, which is public comment. We will have public comment at the end of the meeting as well. So if anyone would like to give public comment, then you'll have a chance to. That'll take us to agenda item 2, which is approval of recommendation for the Cannabis Advisory Commission. And committee members, before I get to that document, I just want to remind all of you and those who might be attending or watching this meeting that, you know, sort of where we are in this process. So we've had 2 committee meetings to discuss potential topics, and I've prepared for us this, it's called proposed regulations for potential actions. But I wanted to remind everyone that the process from here, if we approve these recommendations, what will happen is I'll probably put them in a nicer format. I'll send them to the Cannabis Compliance Board and let them know that these are the recommendations that came out of the Public Safety Subcommittee. The Cannabis Compliance Board will then go through their regulatory process. So they're going to have more public meetings, more input. They'll be able to finesse the language because I'm sure this language isn't perfect. It's mostly pulled from Colorado with some changes to reflect Nevada terminology. So I didn't want to give anyone the impression that this would be the last opportunity on these regulations. There'll be a whole process that the Cannabis Compliance Board will go through. So don't be too concerned if some of the wording doesn't look completely accurate, because that will be fixed in that regulatory process. And of course, all of us will have a chance to weigh in there if you'd like as well. But if we come up with additional things, or there are members of the public who realize that maybe we forgot something important, which is entirely possible, they'll be able to provide that input. So with that said, I think here's how I would like to go about agenda item number 2. I'm not going to read all these items because I think we've talked about all these. What I tried to do is kind of put them in categories that reflect prior agenda items. And then I think I included everything that we talked about. So I'd like to have some discussion on this. I know that there are potentially some proposed additions or changes that we would like to make before we vote on it. And then I'd like to just vote on the recommendations as a whole, if everyone's comfortable, and send them off to the Cannabis Compliance Board, assuming we have a majority who would like to do that. I will note a couple of things. In a few instances, these regulations, I have sort of a note in brackets after the item. And that was just kind of to indicate that, you know, in our discussion, we maybe weren't precisely sure about what the regulation should look like, but we wanted to provide a recommendation to the Compliance Board and then also recognize that they're going to have to go through their process as well. So with that being said, Detective Garber, I wanted to go to you first on the emergency shutdown provision, which for the members of the public watching this would be on page 3, about midway down the page, law enforcement temporary suspension of license. Detective Garber, I know you had some proposed amendments or edits to that item, so wanted to go ahead and get those thoughts from you, please.
Thank you, Chair. Under the law enforcement temporary suspension on the licenses, the department and myself discussed at length. I know you had noted under the 8 hours being the minimum, and we talked about if an event happens over the weekend on a Friday, especially if it's a holiday weekend, the amount of turnaround time that it would take to investigate and have the business shut down, especially if it's something that causes public safety issue. Having 8 hours is just too short of a notice for us to get that done. At a minimum, we would ask that the board would recommend a 72 hours minimum to allow the Cannabis Compliance Board to investigate, to get the investigators out there to actually conduct their investigation before they grant the business permission to reopen. And the other thing we also wanted to note it too as well, I know in the verbiage says the sheriff or the authorized designee for some of our outlying cities and counties, if they might not have a sheriff to put any sort of a primary law enforcement agency or the sheriff's designee for that verbiage is our recommendation.
Great. Thank you, Detective Garber. I think those certainly make sense. I generally just pulled this from the Clark County Code, but I think having a maximum of 72 makes sense. And so my thinking on this a little bit too, and I think the Cannabis Compliance Board will have to kind of iron this out, but as part of the passage of Assembly Bill 341, which allowed consumption lounges, we gave additional resources or gave the Cannabis Compliance Board authority to use resources to hire additional staff. So I think they're going to have a role in the inspecting and investigation as well. And what I anticipate is that local law enforcement will work with them. So I think through their regulatory process, they can kind of figure out what the sweet spot is there, but certainly understand the concern that 8 hours on a Friday night is probably going to be pretty difficult for everybody involved. So I'm certainly comfortable changing that to 72 hours. And I think the recommendation to say primary law enforcement agency makes a lot of sense as well. So I appreciate that feedback, and I will make those edits on the document before it goes to the Cannabis Compliance Board itself. So thank you for that. I have one I want to talk about in just a second, but I want to give other committee members a chance. Are there items on here that you think we missed, we got wrong? Did I misstate what we sort of talked about? So I just want to give folks a chance. And if the answer is no, that's great. So that means maybe we did something right. And look at this. Assemblyman Roberts.
Thanks, Chair Yeager. And look, I think it's an overall great document. The only point I had is the same one that Detective Garber had. It's my experience that 8 hours is just not a lot of time on a weekend. And so I appreciate that change to that. And I support everything else. It looks really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Director Tagliati, Executive Director Hughes. Let's go to Director Tagliati first. Please go ahead.
No, I echo those comments, and I support going to 72 and the verbiage for the possibly rural areas.
Thank you, Director. Executive Director Hughes, did you have any comments or suggestions for changes on the document?
No, I think I agree with the 72 hours, and I think it looks really well. I know that once it goes to the Cannabis Compliance Board, there will be some changes, but I think you did a really good job of, getting all the detail in there that would be necessary to get this started.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. So let me get to the one that I wanted to raise. And so I think we'll probably need to make a little bit of changes to this one, but on page 2, about midway down, this was the leaving with unused product, which we had a pretty robust discussion about. Well, so it turns out Assembly Bill 341 that was passed in section 24, subsection 4, does not allow, by statute, you're not allowed to take unused product out of the consumption lounges. So statutorily, the Cannabis Compliance Board's not going to be able to enact that particular provision. And so I'll just sort of read that so you all can track. And again, this is always a good reminder to read the bill that you passed to remember what's in there before you start talking about regulations. So the section reads, a cannabis consumption lounge shall not allow a single-use cannabis product or ready-to-consume cannabis product that was purchased at the lounge to be removed from the premises of the cannabis consumption lounge. So given that, I don't want to make a recommendation to the Cannabis Compliance Board that statutorily they're not able to enact. But what I think I would like to do on that particular section, I can change the wording. I would like to note for the board that we did have a discussion about potential concerns about overconsumption, and that while we realize statutorily they're not going to be allowed to take product out of the premises. That is something we certainly want the Cannabis Compliance Board to look at between now and next legislative session, and let us know if they believe there's any changes that need to be made through legislation or otherwise. I remain very hopeful that we're not going to have issues with overconsumption, but if we do, then there may be a need for legislative action or for regulatory action. And I would just note that right above that section we're talking about leaving with unused product, we do have the recommendation that medical incidents be reported to the Cannabis Compliance Board, which I think will help allow them to figure out whether this is going to be an issue or not. So that would be my one recommendation, that we don't recommend something that statutorily they're precluded from doing. Though I appreciate the discussion from NUWU, and obviously different lounges are going to have different concepts about how they're going to provide product to individuals. So that would just be the one that I noticed. And thank you for a couple members of the public who pointed out that provision in Assembly Bill 341, so we could make sure that we get that right. I think that was all that I had. I tried to read through here and make sure it looked okay. And again, I will put this a little bit of a better format before we send it off. But I did want to open it up for just any additional discussion. And if there's not additional discussion, I would be looking for a motion to approve these recommendations with the changes that we noted on the record. Okay, I don't see additional comments. Who would like to make a motion? All right, Assemblyman Roberts.
So moved.
Perfect. Would anyone like to make a second on that motion?
I'll second.
Thank you, Executive Director. So we have a motion and we have a second. Before we take a vote on it, any further discussion or comments? Okay, I don't see any. So at this time, we'll take the motion. And I think because we're on Zoom, the easiest way to do it is if you are in favor of giving these recommendations to the CCB, if you could just raise your hand on the screen so I could see you, that would probably be the best way to do it. Okay, I see 5 for 5. So that motion passes unanimously. Thank you to committee members. And over the next few days, I'll get this over to the Cannabis Compliance Board to do as they wish. As you know, they can accept our recommendations, they could reject them, or they could amend them in some fashion, and I suspect that will happen. So thank you, committee members, for that. That takes us through. This is going to be a very fast meeting, so I know you're all going to be happy about that. So we got through agenda item 2. Agenda item 3 is future meeting topics. And so here's kind of where we are. As you all know, when you were appointed to this committee, our primary task in the short term was to do what we just did, which is examine and provide recommendations to the Cannabis Compliance Board. But this subcommittee is going to continue to exist and continue to meet as needed. At this time, I don't know when that next meeting will be, given that we're in October. I think there's a pretty good chance it wouldn't be until sometime next year, because the Cannabis Compliance Board has to, of course, go through their regulatory process for all these consumption lounge regulations. But I wanted to open it up for a discussion from committee members. If you have something in mind that you might like to see at a future meeting, this doesn't necessarily have to do with cannabis consumption lounges. It could anything dealing with public safety, really, and the Cannabis Compliance Board. So are there any suggestions at this point for items that members think we should look at probably sometime in first quarter of next year? All right, I'm not seeing anything. One thing I think, and Director Tagliati has mentioned this a number of times, and I think it was part of our discussion, was this idea of impairment, driving under the influence, cannabis. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about how to hopefully mitigate that through rideshare and other practices. But I think this subcommittee really could play a role in keeping an eye on what the technology is to test in the field when it comes to cannabis. You know, for years I've been hearing about saliva tests. I've been hearing about breathalyzers that, test for cannabis. I've been hearing about all kinds of technology, but I don't know that any of it's actually been deployed in the field and is reliable. But I think that's something we can certainly keep an eye on to figure out, for our law enforcement officers, is there a way that we can make this a little bit easier in the field rather than making them, take someone to usually the jail or a medical facility to have a blood draw. So that's one I'm going to flag, and I'll follow up. I've gotten communications over the years from different companies. Normally they're companies that are developing these products because they're interested in getting into law enforcement and state, getting into states, but I'll follow up with them to see where we are on that technology, because I think we're all interested in doing what we can to make sure we don't have impaired cannabis drivers out there. Assemblyman Roberts.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Yeager. And, I would agree. That is definitely something that needs improvement in Nevada as legalization is, moving not only in our state and other states. I don't think we're as advanced as we are with alcohol, just because I just don't think, officers have the experience and expertise with that, and anything that can help us through technology. I think that's great that we could look at for this committee. I'd love to be involved in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman Roberts. Director Tagliati.
Thank you, Chairman. I mentioned it at previous meetings, so I won't belabor the point, but I think, again, to Tom's point, we're behind many states in this area, and we also have an initiative going forward as far as the state laboratory and so on and so forth. I'd love to see the state take a leading role in not only cannabis research or whatever, but we have to keep in step with enforcement. And presently, without belaboring the point, I think we're missing the boat in a lot of areas as far as determining impairment when somebody's pulled over for driving, erratically or whatever, and we dismiss it as being alcohol if you smell beer and so on and so forth. So I think we kind of missed the boat in last year. So I'd like to see us go forward and maybe next session have something teed up.
Thank you, Director. I know we've had a couple of discussions about a state lab, and I think that's something we certainly ought to talk about. And now that the CCB is going to have a more expanded role in some of this, I think this is probably a good place to have that discussion. Of course, there are interim legislative committees, but those aren't really kicking off till probably December or January. So I think that's a great idea. And perhaps at a future meeting, we can hear from folks at Office of Traffic Safety. I know Ms. Davey in the past has prepared a presentation about a state lab, and I believe provided an analysis of what that would look like and what it would mean for the state. So I appreciate that suggestion. Completely agree. Go ahead.
Again, Amy Davies done a great job, and we received federal support for doing the study on the state lab to begin with, and that all was processed through the Office of Traffic Safety through the federal government. So there's I'm not saying there's gazillions of dollars out there, but there's a lot of support available through the feds if we, stay in lockstep with some of these new techniques that we seem to be lagging.
Thank you, Director. And, I agree with you too. I'll just say my hope is that with additional states coming online with legalization, that we have some more robust research done on cannabis, because it does seem like a lot of the research that's been done is 30, 40 years old, and frankly doesn't reflect the products that are being sold out there today. So, my dream and my hope is that maybe someday we'll have some kind of appropriate standard for impairment, much like we do alcohol. For attendees watching, I know the science is totally different. I get it. But, maybe we can get there at some point and make things a little bit easier on folks to be able to determine who's impaired and who's not. So we'll continue those discussions for sure as we go forward as a subcommittee. And Director, please.
Yeah, add one more thing. With the addition of a lab, we certainly would centralize the laboratory efforts on the purity and et cetera of the product. And my concern statewide is we still have a large amount of illegal grow. Same thing in California, although who knows now with the fires, but what's left. But that's a concern going forward. And I think if we centralize that, we're really ensuring more product safety at the end of the day. And I think the industry would prefer that.
Thank you, Director. Any further discussion items for potential topics at this time? And trust me, you'll have plenty of time in the future as we prepare for our next meeting, which again, I think, we'll do what we always do. We'll poll the members, but I would anticipate probably not until sometime next year, first quarter of 2022 already. Okay, so I don't see additional items there. And members, again, if you do have items that come up, just reach out to me or the CCB, let them know, and we can start developing an agenda for our next meeting. So we will close agenda item 3, which is future meeting topics. That's going to take us to our agenda item 4, which is the second round of public comment. I think we had some attendees who joined us a little bit after we started the meeting. So if anyone is with us on the Zoom as an attendee and you'd like to give public comment, there should be an icon to raise your hand on the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us by phone, you want to press *9 to raise your hand. So we'll give folks just a second here on Zoom to see if anyone would like to provide public comment this morning. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Amber, could you confirm that you don't see any as well?
I see no public comment.
All right, so I don't see public comment either, so we will close public comment. Before we adjourn, committee, I just wanted to thank all of you for the work that you did. And we moved extraordinarily quickly, and all of you are very busy, as am I, so I appreciate that you were able to get on here for 3 of these meetings, and I think we have some recommendations that we can be proud of at this point. Also want to thank the CCB and the staff support for helping me get these agendas ready and getting the exhibits out and all of that, managing the Zoom. It's not easy to do. And if I had to do it myself, I'm sure that we would not be on Zoom this morning. So I appreciate all of your help. And so I think that's it for our committee meeting this morning. Committee members, thank you again, and please reach out if anything comes up. I hope all of you have a really fantastic week. And this meeting is adjourned. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Chair Yeager.
Thank you.
Thank you.